Sometimes when I'm having trouble doing something and I'm starting to get frustrated, it'll occur to me that I should ask the question that I think my mother would ask in situations like this. She would ask, "Have you prayed about it yet?" Proverbs 6:20, which is our memory verse for this week, says, "My child, keep your father's commandment and do not forsake your mother's teaching." I think this is one example for sure where I shouldn't forsake my mother's teaching. I should take to heart that when I'm running into a wall, when I'm getting frustrated about something, the thing to do is to take it to the Lord in prayer. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is going to fix whatever my frustration is in the way that I want it fixed. Prayer isn't a magical tool to get God to help you think to look between the couch cushions to find your missing muted phone, for instance. Although He may help you call that to mind. But in prayer, we welcome God's presence and guidance and peace. We remember that we are not alone and we can't do it alone. And we don't have to do it alone because God is with us in the midst of this. John 15:5, Jesus reminds His disciples of the way that they are sustained by His presence and help with them. He says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me, I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing." There's an illustration of this in our text today in John chapter 21, where we're picking up our series in John. We've just got a couple more weeks here in John. We've been looking at some of the resurrection appearances of Jesus through John chapter 20. And now we have a new scene, a scene shift, a different place in John chapter 21, verses 1 and 2. It says, "After these things, Jesus showed Himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. He showed Himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of His disciples." So you may remember that these early resurrection appearances of Jesus that we heard about in chapter 20, they take place in the Jerusalem area. Well, this is somewhere very different. It's back in Galilee again. Now, if you were just reading Luke's gospel or the book of Acts, you might say, wait a minute, didn't the disciples just stay in Jerusalem and until Pentecost? But we see in John, as well as in Matthew and in Mark, the disciples are told they'll see Jesus in Galilee, that there is this period in between. And so here are the disciples. The Sea of Galilee is called the Sea of Tiberias. Here, Tiberias was the biggest city along the coast of the Sea of Galilee, which is really a big lake. Tiberias is still the biggest city there today. And here we have 7 of the disciples together. This isn't all of them, right? There are 11 of the 12 inner disciples, and we don't actually know if this is the same group or not. Some would say Nathanael is a disciple of Jesus, but he's not one of the 12. But in any case, 7 is one of those numbers that when we see it in the Bible, we think, wait a minute, is this meant to suggest something else? 7 suggests some sort of completeness or unit, 7 days in the week, for instance. We don't know, but in any case, it's us that Jesus has formed His disciples as a church, as a new family, to be together, to serve together, to be on mission together. And here these disciples are together. And now, verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We'll go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Peter, as so often is the case, is the one who's full of ideas. He seems restless and wants to be on the move, on the go, doing something. And so he says, I know, let's go fishing. Now, this is what Peter and some of the others had done for work before they had started following Jesus. And so some people in this passage wonder, they don't know what to do, they're going back to their old lives. Is this a regression on the part of the disciples? Well, that may be the case, but we don't have any indication of that in this passage. For instance, we'll see in the encounter with Jesus, Jesus doesn't say, "Why were you fishing?" Right? That's not what happens here. But their fishing will become an occasion for a lesson. And so they go out, they fish all night. They must be getting frustrated because they don't catch anything. It's one thing not to catch anything if you're just out there for the experience, you're doing catch and release, right? You'd like to catch something, but it was just nice being out on the water. If you're working as a fisherman out on the lake all night, you probably do want to have something to show for it when morning comes. Because otherwise, you're going to feel like, why was I even out here? Verse 4, just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. In John, images of night and dawn are often spiritually suggestive. Night is the period in which people are in the dark about Jesus and about God's purposes and what God is doing in the world. Daybreak, which is also, we were told, the Mary arrives at the tomb, for instance, at daybreak on the day of the resurrection. There's this new hope, this new life, this new era beginning, new hope and possibility. I actually have a picture of, this is the sun rising over the Sea of Galilee. I took this picture when I was in Galilee a few years ago. So if you're on the side of the sea where they would have been, presumably, they would, from the shore where Jesus would be standing, you'd be looking across to the sunrise on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And so Jesus is here. He's on the shore, but once again, they don't recognize him as Jesus. We've said before, this is one of the features of some of the resurrection appearance accounts. We see this in Luke as well as in John. This isn't something that would have been made up. If you were going to make up that you saw somebody risen from the dead, you'd say, we knew it, no doubt, right? You wouldn't introduce this note of uncertainty. But this reflects that this is an eyewitness account. This is the way they experience this. Verse 5. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." Children is an unusual way to address a group of fishermen who've been working all night. That's not just true now, it would have been true then too. But in John's Gospel, this may recall one of the verses that we have in the opening. I said to my Sunday school class this morning, we had somebody in the class who very quickly connected the end of the Bible to the beginning. I said, that's a good impulse. We should do that when we're reading individual books like John as well. And so this reference, children, may remind us, it's actually a different word in the original in Greek, but they're synonyms, so it may make, which says, "But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God." It is telling that this kind of language only begins to be applied to the disciples after the resurrection of Jesus. So, for instance, we looked at a couple of weeks ago that in chapter 20, verse 17, Jesus starts to use this language of the disciples. He calls them his brothers. He says that God is their Father, not just his Father. That's something he's been emphasizing throughout, but that God is their Father. So this is to call them children is to say that he has provided for them through his death and resurrection reconciliation with God the Father, welcome into the family, and they have received it now by faith. They are indeed God's children, part of the family. Verse 6. He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. We may wonder, why do they do this? They don't know this is Jesus. We've already been told that they don't recognize him as Jesus. Their first reaction to having somebody who hasn't done the work all night saying, try this instead, might be to say, yeah, right. I'm not going to waste my time doing that. I know what's here. I've been doing this. This is pointless. In fact, in the parallel, where there's the same kind of miracle story in Luke chapter 5, Peter does initially protest when Jesus tells him to do this. But they might just think, hey, maybe from the shore he's got a different vantage point. Maybe his angle on the water is different than ours, and he can see there's something over there to the right that we can't see. Let's give it a try. After all, we don't have anything to show for our night. Maybe we'll give it one last go. Maybe this guy sees something we don't. When this same kind of miracle story is recounted in Luke chapter 5, the disciples that are there at the time, including Peter, James, and John, who are in this group, when they see it, this miracle, the result is that they follow Jesus. It's earlier in Jesus' ministry, at the calling of the disciples. So then here in John 21, 7 and 8, here's the result. The disciple whom so they've already hauled it. They've got all these fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." I think we're in, 7 and 8. Sorry. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. Now, as I mentioned, this earlier miracle of the same kind is recorded in Luke. Because it's not recorded in John, the impression here that we get is that John, the beloved disciple, that's the usual association, recognizes Jesus' presence because of the abundance of the provision. John and Peter here both function as positive examples, but different kinds of examples. John functions as an example by recognizing Jesus' provision for them. Peter isn't the first to recognize, but when he's told this, he's the one who enthusiastically pursues Jesus' presence. I should say, as one point of clarification, this word here that's translated naked probably doesn't mean fully naked. Just to let you know, it would have been really weird in Jewish culture for that to be the case. But probably because he was working, he didn't have as much on as he would normally have. And so he's a little more presentable by the time he reaches Jesus in this scene. Verses 9 and 10, with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." The charcoal fire, again, thinking back in John, there was also a charcoal fire that Peter had warmed himself by after Jesus' arrest at the place where Jesus had denied Jesus 3 times. Now this is going to play into the passage we're going to look at next week, which is an extension of this scene. And we'll talk about that more here. But for Peter, this has to be a reminder of what's happened before. Notice here that Jesus doesn't need the fish that the disciples have just caught. He already has fish. He's already cooking breakfast. He doesn't need their fish in order to serve the meal. And yet he welcomes what they have caught. Notice it's generous to say that they've caught this. Because after all, he was the one who told them what to do and where to find the fish, right? They understand, John understands this is God's abundant provision through Jesus. So for Jesus to say, "Hey, this is your catch," it's nice of him to include them, isn't it? Probably here the point isn't primarily about fishing and fish. You probably guessed that already. In fact, after the parallel miracle in Luke 5, in the second part of Luke 5:10, Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." In other words, fishing becomes an analogy to the mission of the church, sharing the good news, welcoming people to receive it by faith and to come into the family of God's children, being sent out on the same mission as part of the mission, God's mission, that Jesus was here to do. Not that we achieve what Jesus has achieved, but that we continue to experience the blessing of that and share it with the world. Here, this miracle then probably highlights that the disciples' mission will only be fruitful through Jesus' presence and provision, and when they act in obedience to him. After all, they did what he said. They didn't know it was him in this case, but they did what he said. We might say they followed the good advice that Jesus' mother had given back in John 2:5. Do whatever he tells you. Notice here, if you extend this analogy, that Jesus already has fish. He's already able to serve them breakfast even without their catch. This suggests that Jesus doesn't need the disciples in order for God's mission to the world to be fruitful. And yet, Jesus invites the disciples, and so also us, to take part in that mission and to bring as an offering to contribute what we have caught. Again, that might be generous, right? We can't do anything apart from him that's spiritually fruitful, but it's still something that he makes possible for us to bring. Verse 11, John 21:11. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. So Jesus told them to bring the fish. Peter obeys, right? He does it. He goes, in fact, you get this, again, Peter is enthusiastic. He tries to haul this whole thing onshore himself. Now, he left the others to do the work before, but he's gonna do his part here. We might wonder, why are there 153 fish? Is this number significant? Now, one line of thinking is that the reason we're told there are 153 fish is because that's an impressive number. And if you caught this many fish all at once, you might count them and remember how many it was. And so that may be the point. There's others who say, oh no, the number 153 is symbolic. It has some extra meaning. One of the challenges is that people often can't agree what that suggests that this is actually a kind of complex reminder of what John's been telling us throughout the gospel by a kind of numerical analysis called gematria, in which the key words in the summary statement at the end of chapter 20 are sign, believe, Christ, and I'm forgetting the fourth one. Messiah, that's Christ. Life. I think life is the other one. Well, anyway, if you add up 3 of these numbers, it adds up to of the number of times these words are used throughout the Gospel of John, it's 153. And the other one is there 17 times, which is the triangle that's associated with 153. It's really complicated, right? You go, whoa, that's like way over my head. How would I know that? But that might be like one of those cool little things that gets put in there for people to find. In any case, if the fish represent people coming into the church, if the image is of the disciples' mission, then the unbroken net may be meant to represent the unity of the church through God's grace. After all, Jesus had prayed back in chapter 17, verses 20 and 21, about the church to be one. He says, I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word, that they may be one. As you, Father, are in me, and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. That is, the church is one faith, one Lord, one baptism, drawn together in this common mission as a testimony that God the Father has sent Jesus and given us salvation through him. The passage that we're looking at this morning closes with verses 12 to 14. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. I said this closes the scene, but actually there's an extension of it we'll look at next week. But this finishes the breakfast side of things. Now, the first words in the Gospel of John that Jesus had spoken to a group of disciples was, "Come and see." Actually, it's one of the first words. He asked them first, "Who are you looking for?" Or "What are you looking for?" But then, they tell him, and he says, "Come and see." Come and see. Notice his last words to the disciples as a group in the Gospel of John are, "Come and eat breakfast." Come and eat breakfast. Jesus is inviting them to a feast. Now we might say, fish for breakfast, I think I'll pass. But the point here is that this is a sign of the abundance that he's able to provide them with, that will sustain them on the mission that he's given them. This meal echoes the earlier feeding of the 5,000, which is told about in John chapter 6, as well as in the other Gospels, in which Jesus uses bread and fish to feed a multitude. So this scene reminds us of that, and in John chapter 6, that scene was also an occasion for Jesus to teach the disciples about his coming sacrificial death, which would provide the disciples with true food. In John chapter 6, verses 54 to 56, Jesus says, "Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them." Now, without getting too much into these verses, these signal that receiving the grace new and eternal life. When we take the Lord's Supper, it represents and reminds us of the true food that we receive in receiving grace on the basis of Christ's gift for us of his life. And so then, this breakfast on the beach that Jesus is giving his disciples, it points both probably to the provision of salvation and also to provision for them for the mission that he's sending them on. And once again in this scene we see that Jesus is mysteriously present with them. They, even now, right, they believe it's Jesus, but they don't want to ask him. This is one of those consistent kind of or common themes in these resurrection appearances. We might want to say, well, now they know it's him. Well, it says they do know it's him, but they're not they still want to ask. Part of the point here might be that for us who come after, we recognize Christ's presence in our midst by faith. Jesus had said at the end of chapter 20, "Blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believe." The disciples recognized by faith that it's Jesus who's with them, and that, in the end, is enough. This passage reminds us that though we don't visibly see Jesus, he is present with us by the Spirit as he said he would be. And we can recognize Jesus' presence by faith in his abundant provision for us when we obey him. This passage also reminds us that Jesus doesn't need our efforts, that it's not all up to us to accomplish God's mission on earth. And yet, Jesus invites us to join him in his mission. He welcomes our catch. It's too easy to fall into the trap of acting like it's all up to us, or like we can do it on our own, to put the pressure and the weight on our own shoulders. I know that for myself, too often my tendency when I'm running into a wall in my work or in my life, and I'm starting to get frustrated, is to try to solve the problem by modifying my behavior. To think, if I just do something differently, that's going to fix the problem. Now, of course, improving our habits and our behavior, that can be a good thing. That can be helpful. But by itself, it's not ever going to be enough when it comes to being spiritually fruitful. And when we're frustrated, that should be a prompt for prayer. Just like worry should be a prompt for prayer, frustration should be a prompt for prayer. This passage, now I should say, doesn't mention prayer. I started with prayer and I'm coming back to it. This passage doesn't mention prayer explicitly, but it does seem like a natural application. Because in prayer we welcome God's presence. In prayer we seek His help. In prayer we acknowledge that we can't do His work without Him. Something that we may, just as we're going about the task, act like we believe we can do it on our own. But when we pray, we acknowledge that this is up to God. As Paul said about his own ministry and the ministry of others in 1 Corinthians 3:6, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. The results aren't up to us. That's up to God. What we're called to do is to obey. So when we've tried it our own way, when we've fished all night and caught nothing, instead of just giving up in frustration, let's ask instead, have we prayed yet?